is the crisis of inaction, of manifestation. What's going to work, what's not going to work. And so this period is a very important period astrologically, but it's even more than this. We'll get to it in a moment. This square between Uranus and Pluto occurs 7 times between 2012 and slide and the spring of 2015. 7 times, it's exact. Now, there is a period of 5 or 8 years prior and 5 or 8 years after. Think of the 60s. I mean, the 60s really began in the early 60s and didn't end until the mid-70s. All right, so we're in this period of time, and it's already beginning to happen. And this is a huge thing, but there's a few things that make it even more powerful than just this slide. Someone, John Major Jenkins, talked about yesterday how on November 4th, Election Day here in the United States, how Uranus and Saturn, this is different. Saturn is a faster moving planet. This particular cycle of Uranus and Saturn, they align once every 45 years. And we're at the halfway point in their alignment. It's almost like a tug of war. We're on Earth, and Saturn, the planet of tradition. Saturn is the planet of you see when you get what you see. Saturn is the planet of Isaac Newton, who was a Capricorn. Saturn is, Saturn's sign. Saturn is, for every action, there's an opposite equal reaction. Newton's third law. Saturn is karma. Saturn is responsibility. Saturn is authority, top-down authority. Saturn is hard tests. Saturn is doing the work. Uranus, on the other hand, we already talked about. It's the lightning striking. It's the future. It's progressive. It's exciting. It's awareness. It's awakening. It's opening. So right now, today, this week, on Tuesday, Uranus and Saturn are pulling like a tug of war in opposite directions. And isn't it interesting that even the candidate of Saturn, John McCain, is running on a platform of change, Uranus. You can't make this shit up this good. So, November 4th, 2008, we have the Uranus-Saturn opposition. But it also happens 5 times over the next couple of years. Slide, please. The final occurrence of this is in July of 2010. So we're now in this period of time of this. Election Day will not end this. There is a battle going on, not just in the United States, but synchronistically all over the planet between the old and the new. Between the people who are holding on to the capitalist, Saturnian, governmental structures and those who want to break through and have freedom. Incidentally, this is the same scenario. There was I don't want to do more history. Let's just stay here. You'll notice, however, at the top of this chart is the planet Pluto. And what's happening is that Saturn and Uranus in opposition, as they move further and further into this process, are each and both making 90-degree angles or squares to Pluto, which is a much slower cycle. And you can see here it's happening at 0 degrees of Aries, 0 degrees of Libra, 0 degrees of Capricorn. These are the solstice and equinox points. In other words, astrologically, there are 4 points that anchor the zodiac. This is why a conjunction with the galactic center on an equinox or solstice is so important. So here, we have at the same time that we are conjuncting on the solstice the galactic center, we have Pluto and Uranus and Saturn. This is not just a planetary pair that repeats every 172 years. These are 3 planets that are now in a formation on a very, very sensitive point, the point of beginnings, which is what the solstice and equinox points are astrologically. They are the cardinal points. Cardinal, incidentally, etymologically derives from the word hinge, Stonehenge. And a hinge, we don't think anything much of it, but a hinge was once as exciting a technology as computers are today. Why? Because there used to be walls. And then all of a sudden, the wall became openable. Huge technology. We don't think of things like that. But cardinal signs are hinges. And so we're at an opening point. Slide. The 60s were just an amazing period of time of expression, of artistic expression. Let's just run through these next handful of slides, another slide, just to get a sense of some of the things that were going on in the 60s that we're going to see a little bit of a replay of. Slide, 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 slide. Another, another, another. All right, let's stop right there. You know, the 60s weren't all fun and games. Like many of you that are older now, as I am, you know, you probably lost dear ones during the 60s, you know, in another pointless war. But what happened during that time is that the masses came alive. And although there was a lot of partying, I was there was also a lot of angst because we knew we were up against something that was bigger than us. There are a lot of younger people today that look at my generation and say, you guys fucked up. You failed. You couldn't do it. You didn't do it. And some of the hopelessness that people face today are because they look back and say, well, they didn't do it. They couldn't do it. Well, I'm here to tell you that we get another shot. And we better not blow it this time. Because although these cycles repeat, and if I had time, I could take you through 2,000 years of history from revolts all over Europe. If you want the longer history version, this goes into the history of a couple of thousand years of outer planetary cycles. Back on the table. But the point is that even events like the World Trade Tower bombing, which happened on a Saturn-Pluto opposition that is traceable back through a history that is mind-boggling. We see this from an astrological perspective, rather than the most significant event of our times, you see it as another brush fire of a 2,000-year process. I'm not taking anything away from its importance, regardless of how you frame it. In other words, whether you think they did it or we did it. But we're not going there now. The point is that on one hand, from an astrological perspective, what's coming up in 2012 is a big event. It's a big event. It's as big as the astrological event that we astrologers look at that corresponded with the Black Death, you know, with the plague in Europe. It's a big event. I'm not taking anything away from it. But you know what? The planets keep going around. It's a cycle. It's going to keep happening. But there's a couple of things that make this different. Number one, on a Saturn-Pluto opposition in the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian, who was trying to reform or recreate the Roman Empire, put down a tax revolt in Istanbul, then Constantinople. And in one afternoon, the imperial troops killed by hand 35,000 people in an arena watching a sporting event. And 35,000 people killed by sword and by bludgeoning in one afternoon. That's a little different proportion than a couple of thousand people in a couple of buildings. And again, don't take me wrong, I'm not making any less of what happened there. I'm just trying to put things into perspective historically. Here's the thing. If you lived 50 miles outside of Constantinople at that time, you didn't know what happened. If you lived in England, you never knew what happened. Because at that time, the communication system was such that even synchronistic events were compartmentalized and fragmented and kept apart. Could you imagine that happening today and everyone on the damn planet not knowing about it in 15 minutes? This is huge because what, for the first time, and we saw this in the 60s during the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, for the first time we had a network of communication. And even though it didn't come from the main media, just like the publishing of the Corpus Hermetica was outside of the church, in the 60s what happened was there was music that conveyed the message to us. We didn't listen to music at that time to hear the latest beat, many of us. We listened to it to hear what was going on the circuits. You know, what was Bob saying? Where were the Beatles at? What was happening? What were the Jeff Airplane doing? This was like a communication system. But the big difference between the 60s and now is even that was top down. There were a handful of leaders. There were a handful of people that were making the music, and we were getting it. Now we have MySpace. We have chat. We have the internet. And it's outside of the control of the nation state. The importance of this cannot be underestimated because of everything else that I've talked about here, that what's happening is the planet can change on a dime. It can change direction that fast. However, we have work to do. One last quick thought, and that is that another huge difference between the 60s and the 2012s is that in the 60s, we made it up as we went along. There were no mentors. For those of us who experienced the 60s, we have a role to play because the younger generation, unlike my generation, we looked at our parents and said, what the fuck? And yet my kids and people of that age get that on some level we got it. And so we need to stand up to the plate and not take charge, but encourage and to act as teachers and as guides. This is hugely important, and it can make all the difference in the world. Slide, please. So this is my change to what we've all heard. I love thinking cosmically, but if we don't act locally, it ain't gonna happen. Slide. And is that the last one? One more? That's it. Thank you all.